This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. So an exercise that I started doing last year that I kind of want to make a tradition on this channel is before the week 1 game, I want to look at the Browns' upcoming season from multiple perspectives, right? We brought in somebody from Dallas to talk about what they see from the Browns in this matchup from a Cowboys perspective. And then in this video, I'm going to talk about what the glass half empty perspective could be on the Cleveland Browns and how things could go wrong for the Cleveland Browns in this season. Now, obviously, I'll do a video about what can go right for the Cleveland Browns and how the Browns can exceed expectations this year. But I want to talk about the negative outcome that could be possible, because it's important to remember, no matter how good you feel about your quarterback, no matter how good you feel about your head coach, no matter how good you feel about your GM, your roster, your defense, all of those things, it can go wrong in the NFL no matter who you are. Everybody has down years. Everybody has disappointing years. Even Tom Brady, even Peyton Manning have had years that they felt like, yeah, that was a disappointment, right? So if they're not immune, you ain't immune. And it can happen to anybody. I don't want anybody to panic and say I'm predicting gloom and doom for the season. If you watch this channel, you know I'm not very doom and gloomy, but I am realistic about what I see. I want to talk about some of the potential pitfalls or hurdles that the Browns are going to have to clear throughout the season. Now, one thing I do want to make clear is I'm not saying one thing is going to be able to tear down the Browns season. I see a lot of people doing that in the NFL in general, not just with the Cleveland Browns, and acting as if, oh, if this one thing goes wrong, this team's done, especially with the Cleveland Browns. The Cleveland Browns are a team that went 11-6 last year, and they lost starters at left tackle, right tackle, quarterback, running back, safety. They had starters on all of those positions hit IR. Some of them, multiple starters from those position groups hit IR. And the Browns were still able to go 11-6. So this is a robust roster. They're not a roster that is so fragile that if one thing goes wrong, they're not going to be able to overcome it. They proved this last year. Kevin Stefanski and Andrew Berry proved their ability to zig and zag and figure some things out if things go wrong. And to their credit, every successful season that the Browns have had with Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski has showed some level of maneuverability, and no coaching head coach or GM pairing in Cleveland Browns history since '99 has had to do as much shuffling as this one has had to do. They started with the pandemic. 2021 comes around and Baker Mayfield destroys his shoulder but refuses to get surgery on it. So you play him for the whole season despite him not being 100% healthy and him wanting to be out there. Then you get 2022 where Deshaun Watson, you trade for a new quarterback. He gets suspended for 11 games. You were anticipating a 4 to 6 game suspension, but he gets suspended for 11 games. You're out there with Jacoby Brissett much longer than you expected. And in 2023, the 1 year we were looking around like, hey, it might be normal this year, y'all. It might be normal. Deshaun Watson pops his shoulder off his body in week 3 and never really fully recovers from that throughout the year. So these are all of the things that have gone wrong during the season. And if this shows you anything, it shows you that something's going to go wrong. It's not a question of if something goes wrong. It's a question of when something goes wrong, can the Browns adjust around it? Can the Browns survive that particular thing going wrong, or that particular set of things going wrong? Another thing to consider is that the things I'm going to name here aren't necessarily individual things that I think will just burn a hole in the Browns season if that individual thing happens. These are things that kind of have to compound on top of each other, right? This has to happen, and that has to really cause this to happen, and that causes this to happen, and then that happens, and this happens because of that, and then you end up in this situation, right? It's going to be a compounding effect, not an individual thing that puts the Browns in a lesser position to win football games this year. So just want to be clear. I don't want to make it seem like I'm trafficking in panic like a lot of Browns media is these days, or trying to beat you down or make you pessimistic about the season. We're just trying to look at this season both ways thoroughly, right? What could go wrong? We want to be aware of where those potholes are, where those hurdles are, so hopefully the Browns can clear them. But you don't want to ignore that they exist, right? Which some people sometimes can get a little bit too optimistic and just ignore any pothole that can come in front of them. So here's my list of things. And look, before we even get started, yeah, I know, injuries. Number one, injuries. Yes. I'm not going to focus on injuries in this video simply because I want to talk about some of the things that are more related to the Browns and how they play as a football team, more so than like if they get lucky or not with injuries. The injuries, either they're going to happen or they're not. There's no football solution around the injuries at this point during the regular season. Maybe in the preseason there is, but in the regular season, there's really nothing we could do about them until they happen. So the injury stuff, I want to talk more ball in this video, so I'm not going to address like, oh man, what happens if Jerome Ford and Deontay Foreman? You stink at running back if like all of your running backs get hurt, right? That's kind of obvious there. So want to talk more about the Browns football stuff. And the first football thing I want to talk about that could go wrong, and the thing that's first and foremost on my brain, I think a lot of people's brains, is the slow decay of the Cleveland Browns offensive line. The Cleveland Browns in 2020, when Andrew Berry first got here in Andrew Berry's first offseason, built the best offensive line in football. By far, in 2020, the Browns offensive line was number one in almost every offensive line metric. They had the best left guard in football. They had the best right guard in football, a top 10 center in football, and 2 top 10 tackles in Jed Wills and Jack Conklin. The Browns offensive line looked poised to dominate the rest of the decade, or at least the first quarter of the decade, as the best offensive line, in the same way a decade prior, the Dallas Cowboys had that reputation and still kind of carry that reputation to this day. If you look at the Browns offensive line, that beautiful, robust, dominant offensive line that they built in 2020, it's still there. It's still the main guys there. But it's in need of a renovation. Not it's about to fall over and it's dangerously bad in need of a renovation, but the paint's not is saturated on that wall. The bricks don't look as clean. There's a couple of cracks here and there. It doesn't look as pristine as it used to look. It's still a nice offensive line. Like the Browns fall off here on offensive lines, like Joe Bitonio went from being the best guard in football to like a top 10, 8-ish guard in football. The same thing could be true with Wyatt Teller. The right tackle situation has gone from like having a top 5 to top 10 tackle at right side to somebody you hope could be that level, but right now he's probably top 15, maybe fringe top 10 in DeJuan Jones. And then Jed Wills has dropped from like somebody who could be considered in the top 8 or 10 of tackles to somebody who's more at like 20th when it comes to left tackles in the NFL. So that has gotten a little worse. It has decayed a bit, and it is in need of some TLC and some restoration and some renovation, but it's still a good offensive line. The reason I bring this up as something that could contribute to the Browns failing is the line of scrimmage is probably the most important thing outside of quarterback, and I would even argue including quarterback, your line of scrimmage is probably going to be very important. There's a lot of good quarterbacks who did not have good offensive lines, that did not produce great results because of not having great offensive lines. And if this Browns offensive line struggles, that's going to have a nasty trickle down effect on a lot of the offense. It's going to limit a lot of the new stuff that Ken Dorsey wants to do, because Deshaun's not going to be able to hold the ball for 2.5 to 3 seconds. He's not going to be able to let things develop. He's going to feel the need to escape the pocket more and be antsy in the pocket, which means he's going to put himself in harm's way a little bit more often. And when he takes those hits that are the most nasty, it's not when he's really trying to scramble. It's when he's outside the pocket, drifting left or right, trying to find something downfield because his offensive line can't hold up. That's when Deshaun gets nailed the hardest by the biggest players on the field. So the trickle-down effect from the offensive line decaying, and if it decays at a faster rate than we assume. Right now, we're pretty sure that they could hold up for one more year. I think next year you want to start getting some young guys in there. I would have preferred getting a young tackle in there this draft, but they did not feel that that was necessary, so they're going to try to probably get some young guys in there definitely next year. Like, that's going to be the time where you really want to start renovating and adding new things to that offensive line, because the age is showing, right? Joe Bitonio is getting a little bit older. Wyatt Teller is not the same caliber of guard that he was a couple of years ago. Jed Wills looks like he has regressed in some areas instead of progressed. And DeJuan Jones is super young. We hope he can continue to be on the track that he is, but that's not always guaranteed. You can see a world with this offensive line goes from fringe top 10 offensive line, which is where I think they are right now, to bottom half of the league offensive line, and that could have a trickle down effect on the run game and make sure that that run game falls below whatever you would assume is above water for a run game. And that's another thing I want to talk about. So let's talk about the Browns run game as something that can kind of go wrong, and this is very much connected with the Browns offensive line decaying a little bit faster than what we expect. The Browns run game, I think, is fine if you get good blocking. Deontay Foreman is a pro. If you open up a hole, he's going to get there. He's going to get 3-4 yards. He's going to be fine if you block well. The same can be said with Jerome Ford. Now, I know some people are low on Jerome Ford. I'm a little bit higher on Jerome Ford than most people. The truth with Jerome Ford is if you get him behind a good offensive line, he's going to be very productive and very efficient for you. This is somebody who had the 13th most 10-plus yards runs in the NFL last year, tied with, above Derrick Henry. This is somebody who had more forced missed tackles than Isaiah Pacheco and Jahmyr Gibbs last year. This is somebody who, if you get him in a little bit of space, if you let him get downhill a little bit, can make big plays in a run game. It's just a matter of blocking for him, right? He's not Nick Chubb, where Nick Chubb can cut left and break so many tackles that he creates his own opportunities. No, you need to create those opportunities with a dude like Jerome Ford, but there's a really productive path there for a player like Jerome Ford. But if the Browns offensive line continues to decay, they're not as good as run blocking. They fall below the median point in the NFL when it comes to offensive line pass and run block. Then you can see where that's going to trickle into the run game, and it's going to trickle into the pass game, which brings up Deshaun Watson. Now, this is a interesting conversation, because I am sure this video is about 12 minutes into it. And before we even get to the point about talking about Deshaun Watson, you're going to see a ton of comments. Even if you're watching this video at the 12-minute mark and it just got uploaded, you're going to see a ton of comments. People just immediately saw this link, saw the title of it, and just wrote Deshaun Watson. Because that is the guy I think most people are paranoid about destroying the season for the Cleveland Browns. Now, in order to discuss this in any kind of productive manner, we got to be honest. We got to be honest if you like Deshaun Watson. We got to be honest if you don't like Deshaun Watson. We got to be honest about what the numbers say about Deshaun Watson and what they don't say about Deshaun Watson. And what I'm going to say here is not going to make anybody happy. It's how you know it's probably the truth, because the truth don't tend to make people happy nowadays, because everybody kind of lives in their own bubble. Has Deshaun Watson been a disappointment so far as a Cleveland Brown? The answer is yes. Now, there are reasons that might exist. The 700-day layoff, the injuries last year, All of that stuff is true and valid, I think, for reasons that the numbers have not been great. But let's be honest. When you woke up and saw that the Browns had traded for Deshaun Watson, if right after you saw that trade, I sent you his stat line for the last 2 years, you would be very disappointed. You might be horrified. Now, again, there's reasons that stat line looks like that. But the truth is, there's no way you can flip it. Statistically speaking, Deshaun Watson has been underwhelming as the Cleveland Browns starting quarterback. He's only played 12 games, but in that 12 games, even that output is underwhelming for 12 games from what you expected for Deshaun Watson. There's no way to flip it that it's not. There's not a single way you can flip it that it's not. That is the truth. And if you like Deshaun Watson, you got to understand that's the truth. Now, for those of you who don't like Deshaun Watson, well, this is the part where I make you upset. Because what is also not true is where people take that information after they hear it. Yes, Deshaun Watson has been disappointing. Yes, statistically, these last 2 years have not been great for Deshaun Watson. And if you saw those after that trade, you'd be very disappointed in what he's been able to produce, even in those 12 games, even in that 12-game sample, even considering the fact that he's coming off a 700-day layoff, all of that, you would be disappointed with these numbers. That is true. But also, what is not true is that Deshaun Watson has been so bad in those 12 games that there is any justifiable reason to assume that the Browns are going to win less games simply because he's starting. There's actually evidence that suggests that the Browns are a much better team when Deshaun Watson is starting, despite his stats being underwhelming. And this says to me one thing clearly. If the worst case scenario happens with Deshaun Watson and he continues to play in the same way that those 12 game samples indicate that he's going to play for the Cleveland Browns, even if the worst case scenario is true for Deshaun and he underwhelms this season, the Browns are still going to be able to win games with him at quarterback. Like, he's not been that bad. I think some people make it seem like he's been a detriment to the Browns' ability to win football games. That has not been true. His win-loss record doesn't reflect that. His point differential as starting quarterback for the Cleveland Browns definitely doesn't reflect that. It actually reflects the opposite. He has a pretty good point differential in that scenario. There's just no evidence that the Browns are going to have a harder time winning football games because Deshaun Watson is starting quarterback. There's no evidence. There's evidence actually that suggests the opposite. The Browns will have a much easier time winning football games because Deshaun Watson is starting quarterback, despite disappointing stats. So I'm not really falling into the narrative that Deshaun Watson, whether he plays excellent or not, is going to affect the Browns' ability to make the playoffs. I think there's a very real world where Deshaun Watson has a disappointing stats year, but the Browns still make the playoffs, and it gets real sloppy about how you make that argument. It could have very well been the case last year where he could have had a statistically disappointing season, but had made it to the second round of the playoffs or something like that. So I don't think there's really anything tangible that says Deshaun Watson is so bad that he's going to make you a worse football team than like starting PJ Walker, DTR, Joe Flacco, whoever you want to throw in there, right? So those narratives, I call that bullshit. Like, there's no narrative that you can flip those stats to not be disappointing. There's no narrative that you could say that Deshaun Watson has been so bad that he hurts the Browns' win-loss record. I know it's going to break some people's brains because it's mixing something, it's a nuanced take, and it's mixing something that's negative about Deshaun and positive about Deshaun and coming to a conclusion that isn't just indicting the dude straight up as a terrible quarterback or praising him as the best quarterback we've ever seen wear a Cleveland Browns uniform. But that's the truth. There's really no evidence that the Browns are going to be a worse team starting with Deshaun Watson, even if he plays disappointing. And again, the numbers indicate they'll probably be better if he just stays healthy and still puts up disappointing statistical numbers. So why is Deshaun even on this list, right? This is a reasons why the Browns could fail video. Why is Deshaun Watson here? Well, one, a conversation about him in a video like this is unavoidable. So that's the number one reason that Deshaun Watson is here. I know that people are going to want to talk about it. But the number two reason for Deshaun Watson being here is that if there is a world where the Browns offensive line does decay and that trickles into the run game, and then maybe you have some injuries at wide receiver and it starts to be more on Deshaun, then if these numbers indicate that he has declined like physically as a quarterback, that's going to present a big problem, because then he's going to start trying to play hero ball, and that's going to create more turnovers. Again, it's really no evidence that this is going to be the case, but it's possible that it could be the case and that it could lead to more turnovers and all of that. And it's important to remember there are quarterbacks who put up really deceiving stats. Russell Wilson is a great example of this. Russell Wilson put up 26 touchdowns last year. And, to some people, it's kind of head scratching why the Broncos wanted to get rid of him. But people watch the film. It wasn't head scratching why the Broncos wanted to make that move. There's a reason there's not a lot of criticism of the Broncos making that move, despite Russ putting together a good statistical season. That's because those stats are very deceptive. Russ did a lot of things that did not help the offense or the defense win football games last year. And the same is true in the opposite direction with Deshaun Watson. The stats are kind of misleading on him. I think he did a lot to help the Browns win those games in the games that he started and finished with the Cleveland Browns. There are things you could point to that weren't helpful, right? He had pick sixes in both the Pittsburgh game and the Baltimore game, but I think he made up for it in the case of the Baltimore game. And there were games like Cincinnati where he didn't record a ton of passing stats, but he was effective on the ground. And, a game like Tennessee or Arizona where he doesn't get a lot of credit because they were blowouts against inferior opponents, but he kind of scored the touchdown that made it a blowout. So again, I kind of just put Watson here because you guys were going to want to discuss it, right? And I think there's an important conversation to have there. Let's move on to the defense now. What could go wrong on defense that could tank this season? Outside of injuries, I think an inability to stop the run defensively and a drop in TFLs is on the table. The Browns have less invested at linebacker than they've had since Andrew Berry took over in 2020. I worry about that being a problem for this team. You don't have much depth behind Jordan Hicks in JOK. It's not really encouraging. Like, we're talking about Devin Bush being on the roster, and some people think Devin Bush might play. That means you have no depth there at linebacker. So one or two injuries there could lead to a lot of missed tackles. We've seen Devin Bush play in the preseason. We know he's a missed tackle machine. And if there's a drop in TFLs, that's going to become more and more of an issue. Part of the Browns' run game plan is that they're going to get gashed every once in a while, right? The way they play, the wide nine they set up, the space that they put linebackers in, you're going to give up 5 to 10 yards a pop on a couple of drives here and there in the run game. The philosophy of the defense isn't that that's going to be impossible to do against you. The philosophy of the defense is, yeah, that's possible. But what else is possible with all that space is that we get a TFL and you can't run the ball anymore. If the number in TFLs drops for this Browns defense, then it just becomes a lot more feasible to run against them. And that's the kryptonite to the Browns defense. If you want to solve the Browns defense, have a strong running game and be able to run at will and get 6-5 yards a pop against them. If you're able to do that, then it doesn't matter that Myles Garrett is there. You could just run away from Myles Garrett all game. It doesn't matter they got the best secondary in the NFL. You're not going to throw at them at all, right? All you're going to do is target the interior of the Browns defensive line and the linebackers of the Browns defense, which might be the weakest part. If you can get away with that because they're not getting those TFLs forcing you to be in passing situations, then you can really exploit what the Browns have there and exploit the wide nine. It's not rocket science. This is usually the game plan to defeat a wide nine. The reason the Browns haven't been as susceptible to this kind of thing is because they get so many TFLs. And they're so athletic and they're so dangerous. And once you have to throw, it's easy to fall behind the sticks. And if they're not able to create that kind of situation where a lot of teams are falling behind the sticks against them and they're resetting the line of scrimmage, then yeah, they're going to be susceptible. And that's the soft spot of the Jim Schwartz defense. More missed tackling for the defense too. Like, they missed a lot of tackles last year. If those numbers somehow go up, that's a problem. And then more big plays. Look, the Browns defense, by the way that they're structured, by the amount of man coverages they play, they're going to give up big plays. It's going to happen. It's not about if you give up big plays, it's just how many you give up. You don't want to limit them. You don't want to give up so many big plays that you start to feel like it's 2022 again. But you're going to give up some big plays. But if the big plays get out of hand, then you got a huge problem there, right? Like you got a massive problem there. But that's really it for the defense. There's really nothing structural other than linebacker that I find to be a big issue that could be exploited from this team. But that's my thoughts on what could go wrong with the 2024 Browns and how the season could go in the opposite direction. What are the kind of things that could lead to that? Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.